heading south of the Mason-Dixon. This is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Welcome back to the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. This is your host, Brian McClanahan, and this is episode 314, covering the week of June 20th through June 24th, 2022. Glad to have you back in the program. Very glad to be here. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter, like our Gab page, and subscribe to our YouTube page. You can find all those social media accounts at our webpage, abbevilleinstitute.org. That's ABBEVILLE institute.org. While you're there, give us an email address. We'll give you a free ebook, Exploring the Southern Tradition, written by 20 Abbeville Institute scholars. Again, your gift free of charge just for giving us that email address. Just click on that, subscribe, or put your email in that little box on the webpage. That's how you get the free ebook. And of course, you get on the list. I have people emailing me saying, how do I get on the list? Well, there you go. Go to the webpage, put that email address in that little box there, and then you get the free gift. You can also support the Institute by clicking on the Support tab while you're there. It's a great way to do it. We do exist on your tax-deductible donations alone. So if you like what we do, if you like the podcast, our conferences, our videos, all the stuff, well, then you want to give us a tax-deductible donation. You can also click on that little super thanks button under these videos if you're watching on YouTube. You can make a donation that way. You can buy our merchandise by clicking on the shop tab at abbevilleinstitute.org. That's another great way to support it. Plus, you also advertise what we are. It's high-quality embroidered stuff. As always, rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Let people know that you like it. Share it around on social media. We're not on Facebook, but you can share our articles on Facebook. So just because we're not there doesn't mean you're not there. And, of course, you can share our articles that way. And we do appreciate all of your support. We also have a webinar coming up. If you're listening to this podcast before June 28th, 2022, we have a webinar on Southern storytelling with Brandon Meeks. So if you're on the email list, you know about it already. You want to hop on over the email list and get the advertisement for it and sign up for it. Plus, you can go to abbevilleacademy.org, abbevilleacademy.org. If you miss any of those old webinars, you can pick them up there. But abbevilleacademy.org, there's also a link to it on our webpage. So go pick those up, and you can download our free mobile app as well. Just go to your app store, wherever you get your mobile apps, you can get that free of charge. Lots of great ways to keep in touch with the Institute. All right, well, let's talk about what we did this week. And we've had a lot going on in the United States in the last week, and probably more. I'm recording this before the final day, perhaps, of the Supreme Court issuing all of its edicts from on high. And we had a major one yesterday when it came to concealed carry in New York. Now, of course, that's not the South, but it does have something to do with the Southern tradition. And the piece by Marco Bassani on Wednesday speaks to that. And that would be the Principles of 98. Now, it's amazing because the Supreme Court makes this ruling and you have people like Keith Olbermann on the left all of a sudden rediscovering the idea that states don't have to abide by unconstitutional federal laws or federal edicts. The issue at stake here, of course, was a New York law with concealed carry, and the Supreme Court, through the 14th Amendment, ruled that was unconstitutional through incorporation. This is something we've talked about nonstop on this particular program and other places. Of course, I talk about it too on my own podcast, but that is antithetical to the original Constitution. And this is something the antebellum South was gravely concerned about. The North violating the Constitution, the Supreme Court not doing what is right when it came to the Constitution. In fact, the issue here is not really Calhoun. A lot of people are talking about, this is, the left is rediscovering Calhoun. They're not discovering Calhoun. What they're actually worried about is something Spencer Rowan was worried about in the 18 teens into the 1820s. And that would be the ability for a state Supreme Court decision or the ability to appeal a state law to a federal court and then have the Supreme Court decide on something it has no jurisdiction over. This was the whole case of Cohens v. Virginia. And just to give you a background on what happened there, you had a couple of guys, the Cohens brothers, arrested for selling illegal lottery tickets in Virginia. And these two men were citizens of Maryland. They were selling Washington, D.C. lottery tickets in Virginia. And they were arrested for it, fined, and then that was it. And the state of Virginia had passed a law that said you cannot appeal these decisions to a federal court. Well, they did it anyways, and this is where John Marshall steps in and says, you can't do that. You can't deny the ability to appeal a state court decision, high court decision, to a federal court. So that's really what's at stake here. It's the idea that everything is somehow a federal decision to be made. That's the real problem. And of course, the left is going bananas, saying, well, how can these conservatives say that the states can decide things like abortion, but yet they can't decide things like gun rights? Well, I mean, it's a valid argument, actually. And these are state issues. They're all state issues. Incorporation is really the enemy. And how do we get incorporation? Well, we got incorporation because of Reconstruction. And Reconstruction in the 14th Amendment. Now, the 14th Amendment was never originally designed to do what it's doing. That's actually something that came out of the 20th century, and unfortunately, a Southerner, Hugo Black from Alabama, is the man responsible for that. And Hugo Black, of course, was the infamous Supreme Court judge. He was a Klan member at one point and decided that the Supreme Court needed to enforce the Bill of Rights against the states. This was beginning in the 1940s, but really ramped up in the 1960s. So this is the problem in America right now. We have nationalized everything, and that leads to the situation we saw yesterday at the Supreme Court. And of course, we're going to see it more. We're going to see the left go ballistic if Roe v. Wade is overturned. I don't even know what's going to happen there. I mean, but again, this is going back maybe to the 1850s, 1858, the Dred Scott decision. Southerners actually agreed with a Supreme Court decision there, which invalidated all the compromises that had been passed in the previous 30 years. And the northern states refused to enforce that decision. This is where you get to personal liberty laws. Now, I've been doing these things before that. They refused to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act. And you had people like even Abraham Lincoln. Look, this is what people don't realize about Lincoln. Lincoln was insisting that northern states enforce the Fugitive Slave Law. So was Daniel Webster. So was Henry Clay. I mean, all of these people, and Henry Clay, of course, was a Southerner, and Lincoln was nominally a Southerner, being born in Kentucky, but grew up in Illinois. But you have these people saying, look, what we need to do is ensure that all the protections that are in the Constitution for the South when it comes to slavery are enforced. And Lincoln was certainly in favor of the Fugitive Slave Law. Now, on the other hand, the ability for the federal government to recapture, or people to recapture runaway slaves, was hindered by these personal liberty laws. And the Supreme Court actually ruled that state resources didn't have to be used to round up fugitive slaves, that the United States could send in marshals to do it, that individuals could go do it, but state resources, they didn't have to use state police or state marshals or whatever it is. They didn't have to use any state resources to round up fugitive slaves. So that was another big issue, right? So this is non-commandeering, and this is still in place, right? So the federal government can pass legislation, but the states, through non-commandeering, don't have to actually abide by it, and use their resources for it. And we're seeing the principles of '98. This is not Calhoun, and I saw this many times on social media. Keith Olbermann is rediscovering John C. Calhoun. No. It's not John C. Calhoun at all. In fact, Calhoun was perfectly fine with the Supreme Court stepping in and declaring federal law unconstitutional. And that's really the issue here. We're not talking about a federal gun control law. We're talking about a state gun control law. Two different things. The Second Amendment would apply in a federal gun control law situation. But in this case, it wasn't the Second Amendment. It was the 14th Amendment, which was, by the way, illegally ratified as well. We had states rescind the ratification. I brought this up on my own podcast yesterday with the original 13th Amendment that Lincoln had his fingerprints all over. In fact, Daniel Crofts has called it the Lincoln Amendment, not the Corn Amendment. But the state of Maryland actually ratified the original 13th Amendment. And I think it was just a few years ago. I can't remember the exact year, but they rescinded their ratification. I think it was 2014. They rescinded their ratification of the original 13th Amendment. Now, that's interesting because when we talk about the 14th Amendment, what happened was you had the Republican-controlled Congress during Reconstruction, and this goes back, of course, a piece that we published on Monday about Grant, but I'll get to that in a minute. The Republican-controlled Congress during Reconstruction forced the southern states to ratify an amendment while they weren't really states, at least according to them. So during Reconstruction, you had something called the state suicide theory, right? So once the states had committed treason, supposedly, which they didn't, but once they did, the Republicans said, well, you're no longer a state, you're out of the Union. We've booted you out. And so, but to come back in the Union, become a state again, you have to ratify this amendment. Well, how can a state that's not a state ratify an amendment? Territories can't ratify amendments. That can't happen. It has to be done by the states. And so New Jersey, for example, rescinded its ratification of the 14th Amendment, which would make it to where we didn't have 3/4 of the states ratifying the amendment. And so the amendment was promulgated anyways, right? But the argument was a state can't rescind a ratification. So in this case, Maryland can't rescind its ratification of an amendment. I mean, this is how all this stuff works, right? No one is consistent on the left. No one is a progressive is consistent. They're not consistent about anything. And I would even say this for the Republican Party. They're never consistent. And that's a nice piece by Boyd Cathey this week. But I'll get into that in a minute too. So we have this issue of the Constitution, the principles of 98, what all this means, and the really important people in this idea of nullification. It's not Calhoun. Calhoun's position of nullification is important. Don't get me wrong. I mean, John C. Calhoun is one of the most important political thinkers in the history of the United States. But the real issue of nullification goes back to, in fact, the Stamp Act crisis in 1765. Americans were using nullification then to knock down this illegal Stamp Act. They said it was illegal. And then, of course, moving forward into the founding generation, then we see nullification really take off. And we see it with the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. We see it in the North. They were trying to nullify over and over again during the Jefferson administration and the Madison administration. That's the Hartford Convention, where they actually proposed a series of constitutional amendments. But they were talking about nullifying laws in favor of the War of 1812. We saw this over and over again. And then, of course, moving forward, Jefferson wanted to appoint Spencer Owen as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And Adams beat him to the punch in appointing John Marshall. But, Marshall and the Marshall Court trying to knock down this idea of state interposition, the states having a role in determining what's constitutional and not. This is the important period when it comes to real federalism, this back and forth between Marshall and, of course, the states. And we know that John Marshall and Barron v. Baltimore said that the Bill of Rights doesn't apply to the states. Right? We know it. We know this is the case. It's there. Right? It's in black and white for everyone to read. John Marshall, the Bill of Rights does not apply to the states. Right? So what happened was, of course, incorporation in the 20th century. But we also know that after the 14th Amendment was supposedly ratified, and we have a nice article by Forrest McDonald on the most famous article on ratification of the 14th, the illegal ratification. Just go out onto our website and go to the search box and just type in 14th Amendment or Forrest McDonald, and you're going to get the article. But we know that the 14th Amendment, at least the Supreme Court interpreted it as not implying the Bill of Rights to the states, not incorporating the Bill of Rights against the states. I mean, we know this is the case. It's only in the 20th century that you see this, and it's this extreme nationalism that creates all the problems we're seeing in America today. One-size-fits-all government, and the Southern tradition has long been opposed to this, right? I mean, Calhoun called himself a nationalist or a unionist, but what he realized is that in order to have a real union, you had to have a very limited central authority, because when you got into these issues of state powers and the culture wars, what we're seeing more than anything else, that's going to create a lot of discontent if you let the states and the people of the states and the political culture of the states handle these issues. Then you're going to have a much more peaceful and workable union. The reason the union is torn asunder is because we had one-size-fits-all government trying to dictate one area to the other, either north to south or south to north. It's not going to work that way. And nowadays, we get urban-rural splits. We get these kind of things. We also get red states, blue states, whatever it is. But we're seeing, again, this idea that when the party's in power with a slim numerical majority, this is what Calhoun was talking about. When you had a slim numerical majority, you're never going to have workable government. So Calhoun is important when it comes to a resistance to one-size-fits-all government. But the issue here is more Spencer Rowan-esque when it comes to the states and their relationship to the federal courts. So there's a lot of stuff going on in that. Let's talk about Grant. The piece on Monday was by Phil Lee, and it was Grant's failed presidency. This is his book, and he actually published the introduction to it, which is very good. He's published similar things on before that we run on the website. Phil Lee's book on U.S. Grant from Shotwell Press, you've got to get it, just like his book on Reconstruction, which is not published through Shotwell, but very good, Southern Reconstruction. You got to get both of those books. I'd highly recommend them. But Phil Lee's piece on Grant and how Grant really was a bad president. Grant is given all of this credit for being this now by Republican partisans as being this great president. The U.S. Grant, the man of civil rights, the man trying to put the Union back together. But U.S. Grant was actually very corrupt. U.S. Grant was not a good president. U.S. Grant was overseeing military reconstruction, which was a horrible stain on the United States. It was a complete loss of civil liberties in the South for a large segment of the population. And so this isn't good government that Grant was presiding over. And I think that's the thing that people miss about Grant. But of course, today, Reconstruction is seen as a glorious period that didn't go far enough, right? The South deserved to be punished. These traitors deserved everything they got. And so that's the historical profession when it comes to Reconstruction. It didn't go far enough. It's an unfinished revolution, as Eric Foner says. This is the real issue nowadays when it comes to the interpretation of the war and Reconstruction. That's the historical profession. That's where they're moving. Reconstruction didn't go far enough. It was not something that accomplished everything they set out to do, which was completely transform the South. And of course, when you look at this idea of state suicide, and that came out of the radical Republicans, and then of course Texas v. White, which essentially codified what they did. It said the Congress can boot these states out of the Union if they want to. They committed suicide by leaving the Union. So the Congress is more than able to ensure that states can be removed just by the will of Congress. And so that gave legal cover to what they were doing during Reconstruction. But it also said, of course, that a state can't unilaterally secede, and that gave cover for the war. So this Texas v. White decision was a purely political Supreme Court decision. It's amazing to me, too, how people pick and choose the Supreme Court decisions they want to abide by, they want to say are accurate or not accurate. It's amazing to me in that regard. I've always thought that the inconsistency in these people who take this Supreme Court decision as sacrosanct, but yet this Supreme Court decision is no good, and we got to do so. I mean, this is the problem with the Supreme Court. Again, it all comes down to this belief in nationalism, and we have a one-size-fits-all government, a central authority. I mean, Salmon P. Chase in that decision of Texas v. White was simply regurgitating Abraham Lincoln from 1861, where we said, we have an indissoluble union of indestructible states, whatever it is. I mean, we once you're in, you can't leave unless, we say you're out. I mean, this is the whole point. This was Lincoln's point in 1861. Stupid. I mean, it doesn't even make sense. The founding generation would not have recognized this argument when they ratified the Constitution in 1788. In 1787. They wouldn't have recognized the argument in 1783. They wouldn't have recognized the argument in 1776. They wouldn't have recognized any of that. Now, of course, Chase and Lincoln both said, well, you could leave through revolution, but you can't leave. The state just can't leave the Union. It's indissoluble. It has to maintain. It can't ever be broken apart unless the other states agree to it, or we boot you out, right? So all this legal mumbo jumbo that these people, these twists these people try to make to either defend their position or justify their actions is just amazing to me. And that, of course, that's the grand old party, right? That's the Republican Party. And this is Boyd Cathy's point on Friday. The stupid party, strikes again. It damages the South. When you look at all the things that are happening in Washington, D.C., and so many Southerners, and we just go back to the issue of firearms, right? We have this new deal in the Senate. You had a number of Southerners support this new legislation that Congress has passed, expanding red flag laws and other things. And Southerners voted for that. And Boyd Cathey is saying, here's the grand old party betraying the South. And there's so many issues. He talks about holidays. We just had Juneteenth. We'll talk about that in a second. That was, a huge majority of Republicans supported that. Same thing with MLK, the MLK holiday. Republicans supported that. You have all kinds of things. You look at the base renaming proposals. Republicans supported that, and Boyd brings that up too. So it's not that these things, if you look at holidays, states could do these things all they want, but having a federal holiday, and particularly with Juneteenth, which is a holiday that supports nothing. Juneteenth is the most ridiculous holiday we've ever created in the history of the United States. You can understand Martin Luther King Jr. Holiday. You can understand that. But of course, you can understand where people are going with that. Now, I think we've done a nice job in explaining why that holiday should not have happened. But you can at least understand that one. Juneteenth, there's not even anything to recognize there. Juneteenth is a fake holiday. And this goes back to Lincoln, right? So we have the idea that somehow on June 19th, 1865, a number of slaves in Galveston, Texas, realized they were free. Now, they supposedly have been free for 2.5 years, but they didn't know it because of the Emancipation Proclamation. Well, we know this is not the case. If you read the original Emancipation Proclamation, Texas was, of course, covered by it, and so were most of the southern states, except for the areas under Union occupation. This, of course, was January 1, 1863. Lincoln omitted the areas that the Union controlled. Slaves were not free in those areas, but they were free in areas he did not control. So in other words, Lincoln is freeing slaves he has no control over. And Benjamin Robbins Curtis, who was one of the dissenters in the Dred Scott decision, an abolitionist, said, you can't do this. You cannot abolish slavery in these states if they're still in the Union. You can't do it. And even if they're not in the Union, you don't have any power to do this. There's nothing in the Constitution that gives the president the power to do this. And of course, Lincoln's argument was, well, this is the war powers, right? This is what, as a war powers, as commander-in-chief, I can do anything I want to best subdue the enemy. That was his legal reasoning. And so the Emancipation Proclamation really didn't free any slaves. And we know that slavery didn't end in the United States until December 6, 1865. That's when slavery ended in New Jersey. That's when slavery ended in Delaware. And that's when slavery ended in Kentucky. We know Mississippi rejected the 13th Amendment. But those states still had slavery. There were still slave auctions in Kentucky in November of 1865. New Jersey still had slavery, a nominal form of it, right? It was an apprenticeship system, essentially, but you had to be a certain age before you were freed out of it. But it was still slavery until December of 1865. Now, Delaware, of course, I think in 1860, Delaware had like 2,000 slaves in it. Some very small number. I can't remember the exact amount now, but it was an insignificant amount compared to the other southern states. But and most of those people had, slavery wasn't really being enforced as much by the end of the war. But regardless, legally, it still existed in the state until December 6, 1865. So if we're going to celebrate the end of slavery, which, of course, would be a good thing, let's celebrate it on the proper day, not some made-up day where nothing really ended. And this was a state holiday, and this is the piece was talked about on Tuesday. This was a state holiday in Texas because it dealt with Galveston, Texas. That's it. It wasn't anywhere else. I mean, slavery ended wherever Southerners told their slaves that they were free. I mean, during the period of the war, or right after the war, that's when slavery ended in those areas. And then legally, it wasn't abolished in the United States overall until December of 1865. So celebrating Juneteenth is, just picking a day. It's almost like you just pick a day out of thin air. Oh, we're just going to celebrate it on this day. It doesn't make any sense. It's the most worthless federal holiday ever when it comes to an actual day to celebrate. Right? So again, celebrating the end of slavery, that will be a good thing. That's nice to celebrate. But let's pick the right day to do it. So we'd have to move this to December 6th. Now, no one would want to do that. And they wouldn't want to do that because that would bump into all the other holidays around there. And the intent of Juneteenth from the beginning has always been to replace July 4th, which is just a couple of weeks later, with Juneteenth. Now, what's amazing to me about that is you go back to the founding period, and you actually had two separate holidays at times. Federalists would often celebrate George Washington's birthday as a great day, and Republicans would often celebrate July 4th as a great day. So you had different visions on what holidays we should celebrate in America based on politics. And I think we're going to start seeing that again, right? You're going to have the left generally celebrate Juneteenth, and you're going to have conservatives generally celebrate July 4th. I think this is going to happen. Because July 4th is now being stained with the founding fathers and slavery and all these things. And so no good progressive could ever support a day like that. And of course, it's a day that honors independence and what basically comes down to secession, even though Lincoln said that's not secession. But this is what it is. So you can't celebrate that if you're a good progressive, but you can celebrate Juneteenth if you're a good progressive. You see, this is the issue. You're going to start seeing these holidays be politicized to a point that you're probably going to have a split in what people celebrate. And this is by design, I believe. I do think that there's going to be a push. I mean, the founding generation is already going through the cancel wars, right? They're already starting to be canceled. And so you're going to see, I saw online somebody said 30 years. I don't think it's going to take that long. I would say it's a decade. Within the next decade, you're going to see an attempt to cancel the entire founding generation. Some are already being canceled. You're going to see an attempt to supplant July 4th with June 19th. You're going to see at some point, maybe an attempt to redesign the U.S. flag. There's already been some talk about that. All of these things are going to happen. And they're going to happen because of the culture war. And they're going to happen because Republicans, going back to the piece, Republicans are allowing these things to happen. Nikki Haley in South Carolina. The Republican Party is as responsible for this as the Democrats. This is Boyd Cathy's point. There's no Southern conservative party anymore. It just doesn't exist. But yet, Southerners go out and willingly pull the lever for Republicans, thinking they're the conservative party if they're a conservative Southerner. And there's really nothing there to represent them. We've seen this now for the last 50 years. Right? This was George Wallace's point. It's not a dime's worth of difference between the Republicans and the Democrats. And this is why he was running as the American independent candidate before he was shot. And so, this is something people have talked about in the South. And the South has always kind of gone its own way at times. We had, not just with Wallace, but the Dixiecrats, and you've had the nullifier parties. South Carolina voted its own way twice. You've always had the South, and Breckinridge, of course, looking for their own kind of candidate. And regardless of the issues, this is something they've always wanted to do, right? They've always been very independent politically. And so there's some talk, maybe there needs to be some type of Southern party again. The problem with all of that, I see it as people don't want to split the Republican Party apart because, they're focused on the center. They think that if we don't control the center, we lose everything. But in reality, if you controlled the states, if you look at what Ron DeSantis is doing in Florida, strong governors, even during COVID on the left, right? Cuomo in New York, he was praised by the left for standing up to the Trump administration, et cetera, et cetera. So we know that governors still control so much of American politics, but we always focus on the center. So that's, all these things kind of work together this week. Reconstruction, you've got Juneteenth, you've got the Republican Party, you've got the Principles of 98, and all these things going on. All this is part and parcel of the Southern tradition and what the Southern tradition still means for America. Decentralization, there's the battle with the Supreme Court. It's all the same stuff. Nothing really has changed. The culture war, it's always been there. Nothing's really changed in America. It's just that the Southern tradition offers a counterweight to a lot of these things. Well, this is what you could do or not do in these particular situations. Last thing I want to talk about very quickly is this piece by Brandon Meeks, Mother Jones. It's another great short story. And this will end with this because, Brandon Meeks is going to join us on Tuesday the 28th to talk about Southern storytelling. And this is a lost art. It's something that's very important to be able to tell the stories of a people in a place. And if you look at history, just in general, what is history? It's a story. And the earliest historians relied on stories, right? You go back and you look at the Iliad, the Odyssey. These are stories. The tradition of the oral tradition, right? For lack of a better word, but the oral tradition is so important for the continuity of a people. And telling these stories, being able to pass these stories down, and this was often done with mothers telling stories to their children. Passing these stories down is such an important part of maintaining a tradition, a people, and a place. And so if all the things are gone tomorrow, all the monuments are down, and we saw what they did with the Jefferson Davis monument there in Richmond, just ridiculous. If all these monuments are removed, as long as you still have the songs and the stories, you can still keep these things together. But they're even trying to go after that too. So the literature of a people is so important, and the stories are so important. This is why we wanted to have Brandon Meeks on and talk about stories. He tells different kinds of stories, but everyone can tell stories of a people and a place, and that's why we want to focus on this idea of storytelling. So join us on the 28th. If you're on the email list, you've gotten emails about that. $10 to join us. Not a lot of money. It's a Zoom webinar from the comfort of your own home. You can ask questions. We're on for an hour, 7:30 to 8:30 Eastern time, 6:30 to 7:30 Central. And so, come on out and join us for that. We'd love to see you there. And until next time, good day.